Michael Kerner. Welcome to the Virtual Lens Summit. This is probably our 24th or so. We've sort of been spacing them out. Obviously, this started in the wake of the pandemic when the Pacific Northwest Lens Summit was canceled, and then we turned it into a weekly virtual thing, or almost weekly virtual event. Today we have Art Adams on with Arri. Art Adams is Arri's City Lens Specialist, and he's going to be introducing us to the Arri Signature Zooms, which is super exciting. And we have guest director of photography, Logan Schneider, on, who shot a film recently with the Signature Zooms called The Heist. And he crafted this film in a way to push the limits of the zoom lenses and show how they match the Signature prime lenses. And they're both up here as co-hosts. So Art, go ahead and take it away.
Okay, thanks everyone for coming. I see a lot of familiar names and faces, so this will be fun. Part of my presentation is death by PowerPoint, but it's pictures, lots of pictures. And we're also going to talk to Logan a bit about the heist, but just to get started, let me kind of lay out what we're going to do, or what I'm going to do. So let me share my screen. All right, hopefully that is sharing my screen. So what we're going to cover is a bunch of different stuff. So we're going to talk first, I'm going to go over what the philosophy is behind the lenses, behind the zooms and the primes, why we designed them the way we did. We're going to compare, well, then we're going to look at a little behind the scenes video with about the heist with Logan, where he talks about some interesting stuff. And then I want to drill a little deeper with Logan on some of the things he says in the video. So we'll spend 10 or 15 minutes talking about that. Then I've got some comparisons between the zooms and the primes that I shot, just to kind of show how close they match. I think it's pretty interesting. It's video and zoom, it's never a great idea, but I can really figure out another good way to do it. I guess at some point I can pull stills and try to do that, but I'm going to show the video and we'll see how far we get. We're also going to just take a look at where signature zooms fit in with all the other zooms that are kind of out there as far as tech specs and things like that. And then I'm going to recap what the look is. That's the part where we're just talking about what the signature look is. That kind of unifies the primes and the zooms. You can't make zooms that look exactly like primes, but the core of the signature look, we've done a really good job of matching, I think. And I want to touch on what that is. But first, let's talk quickly about the philosophy, and then we'll watch Logan talk a little bit about the heist, and then we'll talk directly with Logan about the zooms. So the idea was that there's a lot of lenses now that, as displays get better and better, they may become a little bit obvious in what they're doing. Lens aberrations can be really cool. In Rec 709, they can look really interesting. In UHD, HDR, higher resolutions, you can really see what a lens is doing. Sometimes that works for the material, sometimes it doesn't. And what we tried to do was figure out a way to make a look that didn't kind of get between the viewer and the story, because that tends to be harder to do, and that's kind of where we live as a company. Is like, what can we do that maybe not everyone can do? So we really try to push the limits. But the challenge was, how do you make a lens that's not uninteresting, or that's, you know, it's still compelling in the way it looks? And I think we did it. And I've shown pictures before. Last time I was on the summit with the signature primes, I showed a lot of images that I hope are compelling. I have some of those images and some more to show this time if we want to get into that a bit more. But what we tried to do was design a look that's basically, you can't completely eliminate lens aberrations. We've done a really good job, but then what we tried to do was balance what was left. So basically try to create a lens where it's a kind of a balanced look where no one aberration really draws attention to itself. And the result tends to be kind of an immersive look at the point of focus. Once you get beyond the point of focus, the bokeh is very dreamlike. And it's interesting because there's a lot of, I think, a lot of separation there, because at the point of focus, everything looks very real. And then suddenly all the hard edges drop away. And of course, your eye is attracted by hard edges. So if you have at the point of focus a high resolution image that doesn't feel artificially sharp and just feels natural, but then the background has no hard edges at all. I feel it's a really interesting look. I'll show you some more examples of that. It's designed to work in just about every format so far. A lot of people think that since we released these, the signature primes released with the Alexa LF, that they are just large format lenses. They're not. They're designed for everything. They work. I've tried them on Super 35 8K cameras. They work really well. There's actually a 9K prototype camera that we tested in Australia with the signature prime, and I've got an image from that. It's pretty interesting. And basically the idea is that we've got 16 primes, 4 zooms, plus an extender, and they all intercut with the same core look, and they do a pretty good job. But don't take my word for it. I'm going to show you pictures. So first, I want to show you this little behind the scenes film that we did with Logan talking about the heist. I won't show you the heist because it is pretty choppy. So it's on YouTube. It's on the Arri YouTube channel. If you haven't seen it yet, go check it out. It looks great. But for this, I think it's just interesting to hear what Logan has to say about his experience and what he was trying to do. And then after that, we'll have a little conversation, drill a little bit deeper on that. So let's see how this video plays.
We tried to treat it like a real short film because I feel like it's a much better test for lenses and other gear, putting it in a narrative environment, not babysitting, having an ambitious schedule, so they have to live up to the speed of a real shoot. We made it where if it wasn't something that could hold up, it would be the weakest link and it would show right away. And the lenses did fantastic. This was the daytime scene, and the goal of this was to have really natural skin tones and have a really bright environment outside and pretty dark inside, and still be able to have all the resolution, all the contrast in a really crisp image. That's one of the biggest, most challenging situations for any lens, let alone a zoom. Most primes can't deal with this situation. And here you can see a really clean line from the actor to the outdoors. Dark, high contrast, and with color is really unforgiving on a lens. A lot of lenses will start to go gray on skin tones. They'll start to blend and get muddy on the low end. So what this tested was how clean are the highlights? How do they roll off? Are the shadows clean? And it really keeps that contrast there. And what I noticed years ago with master primes is that I could underexpose a half stop more and still get the same amount of information. And that let me light differently. And so that's something I really like to test on lenses, is whether they can have that low light definition so that I can still tell the story. I want everyone to understand what's happening, but I have more range to do that. Traditionally, there's been a lot of compromises to make a zoom. So what you gain in flexibility and speed, you lose in T-stop, and you lose in resolution, breathing, and it just feels different. This is the first time that I feel like this is part of the same lens set. These just happen to be zooms.
Okay, Logan, welcome.
Hi.
We actually talked about this yesterday, so you probably have an idea of what I'm going to ask you, but I'm curious if you could go into a little bit more detail about what you mean by these lenses being part of the same lens set.
So in my experience, first of all, thanks for having me, Michael. Thanks for having me, Art, and everybody coming. In my experience with zooms, not since the film days when film could blend the lenses to a certain extent. Hasn't really been a zoom that, or just series of zooms that matches any set of primes. So say you're shooting master primes on digital, you either can have a super sharp clinical lens that maybe is as sharp, but doesn't have the character and skin tones of those master primes, or you can have something with beautiful skin tones that just doesn't hold up in terms of definition. And so having a set of zoom lenses that really matches a set of primes and really has the same characteristics, opens up a lot of doors in terms of when to use zooms, how to use zooms, and not feeling like you're compromising your image or the story.
Now, part of that, you talk about how you feel like you can expose differently with
Yeah.
signature primes and signature zooms, and I'm curious if you talk a little bit more about that, because I found that really interesting.
As I was saying about master primes is where I kind of started to discover this, master anamorphics. I could expose a third to a half stop down and still have the same amount of definition, because there's so much separation in the contrast and the shadows and the color definition in the shadows that everyone would perceive the same information, even though it's lower. And that basically gave me more dynamic range to work with, because I could play it a little bit down and now suddenly I have another half stop on the high end to roll off highlights, or protect highlights and pull it back when I need to later. And it also, because digital is an additive color space, it also, I found, to have a more natural color as you play it a little bit down on the curve. So I had been playing with that for a while, and then when signatures came in, it was that, but more. So it read all the little intricacies. We did one test that we screened at Arri where I was filming my I guess 2.5-year-old daughter at that point in magic hour at a friend's house in Topanga, and the sky bounce on one side and the warm diffused sunlight on the other side mixed with shadows. You could see every little color definition, and it was starting at keying a half stop under, so everything was there, and it didn't feel like a dark image. It felt like a rich, it felt real in terms of where the exposure was. I wasn't bringing it up to capture everything. I could play it as my eyes saw it.
Interesting. And let's see. So the other thing that I was going to ask you about, well, I guess that factors into the comment you made in the video about skin not going gray at darker exposures. You can underexpose and still see flesh tone coming through. That same kind of color separation.
Yeah. To have true flesh tones way down at the bottom of the curve is exceptional. I don't see that in other lenses. So again, that comes to a point where it gives you more choices about where to expose. It also gives you more options, because if something's grayed out on the low end on skin, you can brighten it up, but it still is missing that color. So you have less flexibility later. I had a friend take out the signatures mid-October, and I talked to them about this a little bit, and I asked how it went, and he said, yeah, I kind of exposed them normally for like an hour, and then went and looked at it with the DIT and started playing them down just a little bit, and they just started to sing. It was, he started raving about them as soon as he played it a little bit down. Just have to kind of get to know them a little bit and see where they like to live. It's just a little bit different than other lenses.
And you also mentioned in the day interior scene, really stressing the lenses by having a dark interior, a face against a bright background, and how a lot of lenses can't deal with that. Could you talk a little bit about that?
So one of the things that blew me away with the primes was before we took the prototype primes and prototype LF out 2 years ago, we tested at the old Burbank space, and we were in the dark space, basically almost all the lights off, and someone opened the door to the bright Burbank sun, which was probably 10 stops over, and there was still a clean line along the door, so there wasn't the halation into the darkness. And that's exceptional for a prime. I only know of 2 sets that can do that really well, and signatures being one of them. So to ask that of a zoom is unreasonable. And so that's what we tried to do. So it was probably 6+ stops between the shadow side of our actor, especially as we pulled back with the African American on gentleman on the right, Mo, and against super bright background, not clipping, but on the edge of within a stop of clipping. And to have a super clean line is phenomenal. And so it takes away some of the restrictions on zooms. If you can get into really high contrast situations like that and keep lighting for the story without having to protect the lens and tone down the contrast just because it's a zoom, if you don't want those aberrations. So it's yeah, we put it in a pretty unreasonable situation, and it still did really well.
We've got some images, still images that you captured with 2 signature primes that would be fun to take a look at. But I'm just curious, any other impressions from the heist shoot and working with the zooms that we
one of the things that was really, you know, we had these plans to switch to primes for certain shots, and we only ended up doing 1 shot on primes, which was too wide for the zoom ranges that are available. It was a high crane shot showing the whole building. So we were able to stay on the zooms, work them hard all day, both zooms, front, close up, into the lens, everything. And the real lack of ramping is impressive. Not having that exposure change that we've all kind of resigned ourselves to at the end of a long zoom. And being able to light dark and have that definition and not babysit the zooms. It's so rare that you don't have to give up certain things for that flexibility, and I didn't feel like I was giving anything up, so we just stayed on the zooms, and that's a testament to the quality, because we weren't trying to make it easy.
You stressed that during the shoot. You were really trying to torture them.
It's more fun that way.
Yes, it is, always. You want to talk about these images, the prime images? Because these are really interesting. So these are, let's see, these are signature primes, not zooms, but I always find it interesting to bounce back and forth between the look, because the look is essentially the same, but let's take a look.
So I've kind of had a personal project during this whole lockdown of trying to use a mini LF and signature primes as a template, as a base lens, because they're the cleanest lens, the most even lens, and the roll off is calmer than focus on, say, a master prime, which was like a razor sharp line designed for film, designed to punch through to the red layer. And so these are of a more film-like rounded focus line, focus plane, I guess. And so I've been kind of deconstructing the things I like about film and trying to build those onto digital using this combination as a platform. And a friend of mine, Kyle Hoekstra, is a fantastic DIT that's been helping me do that. And so I was doing a little demo thing with Anton Bauer with their 26-volt batteries, which are let you run an LF for an hour and a half on an onboard, which is amazing. So we were just running around on the shoot, no backup, no power chargers, nothing. We just kind of made the most of that ability. And so my neighbor Victor here in Venice is a personal trainer, and I've seen him during all this quarantine and lockdown doing his training in the middle of the alley, and it was kind of a cool look. So I decided that this would be a fun thing to play around with in natural light. So we shot at dawn and into the early morning. And so I have a couple shots here that represent kind of going down that road of using this platform to degrade it And once you create this degraded LUT, putting it back in the camera, exposing for that LUT, and then you get something like this. And now you can't see as high res here, but there's a lot of texture in this. You could maybe zoom into it as well. But everyone I sent this to ask what they thought of it, thought it was black and white film. And I could introduce the aberrations I wanted, but I didn't have to take any. It's not, if you use some vintage lenses, they're inconsistent, there's color fringing, you can't control it all the way. Here I was able to control it, build these LUTs, finesse them in post, and have something that's kind of a blend of the old feeling, but the consistency of a modern lens. And this is really exciting to me, of finding new textures, finding new new capabilities in terms of light and lenses. So this is a very steep curve, a dropped toe to kind of show what happened with like the light within grain, the contrast inside film grain. This has, I pulled out some of the red, desaturated the red and orange like a tintype, as if it's to emulate orthochromatic film. And there's some vignetting, some softening on the edges added. And this is straight out of the camera now. So I did the testing phase, built that post pipeline, put it back in the camera. And this is what I was looking at on set. And so I could build that. But I also know that I have all the light in the eyes if I want it. I have everything here, all the abilities of digital, with the feel of plus X reversal. And it's hard. I haven't been able to do this reliably with lenses that don't have that softer roll off and a more consistent feel to them. So this is a long exploration that I've just started, but its signatures are a great platform for this, because they're the cleanest, sharpest, they have a lower contrast, a calmer roll off. And so you can build anything you want onto it, but you don't have to worry about taking things out of the look. So that's a nerdy side project.
Very cool. Thank you. Yeah, I love those images. They have it's interesting because I have some stills actually in the presentation, if I get to them, from Haunting of Bly Manor. And it has a very similar feel, where they used a lot of nets, and the combination of the nets with the signature primes has this weird, it's a really intriguing modern vintage look hybrid.
Mm-hmm.
And actually also, I've got some stills from Echo Boomers, where the DP was trying to do something very, he talked about the same thing, Carlos Verone. He was saying that they're so malleable that he was able to, he would drop nets in and out, and different nets depending on what he was doing, and get a range of subtleties. You know, he felt like he could paint with a really fine brush and then drop a net in and paint with a coarser brush. So,
yeah,
something interesting. So, well, thanks very much. I know you're in a hotel room, so
thanks for, yeah, sorry about that.
I won't keep you too long.
Just did some nice paintings here.
Very nice. But yeah,
does anyone have any questions about any of that?
Logan, could you talk about the, there's been a lot of talk about the weight and how light the magnesium lenses are with the primes. Could you talk a little bit about the zooms and their size and weight?
In terms of construction, not everyone has gone for the lack of breathing, and I'm really glad that Arri has, because after using master primes for a long time, it's hard to go back. And so I appreciate that they invested the scale to make it work, but you have a big lens that, fortunately, by going magnesium, doesn't weigh much. It doesn't weigh what it looks like. Anyone that's held one has never complained about it. Yeah, it's I really think that going with magnesium has made them much more tenable in terms of Ronins and any other gimbal work. Is that
Yeah.
the right sort of thing? It's
Thanks.
I like a lighter lens when it's possible, but I don't like giving up too much.
And then maybe this is a question more for Art. Are there doublers for these?
There's an extender, and yes, that's part of what I'm going to show. All right, any other questions for Logan, or shall I plunge into pictures and PowerPoints and diagrams? All right, that looks like it. Thanks, Logan. Really appreciate it. Thanks for coming out, and thanks for shooting
Thanks,
Heist.
Logan.
Pleasure. Bye, everyone.
All right, let's go into, let's see, it'll be this window. Okay, so what I wanted to do was I wanted to sort of prove to myself that these were as much of a match as other people said they were. And we shot this actually after Heist. So, I mean, Logan had already been talking about how he felt the look was, you know, it really, all the lenses were clearly part of the same family. And I kind of wanted to figure out what that meant and if it was really true. So, because I hadn't actually seen for myself yet, and I tend to really drill into these things probably way more than it's healthy. So, basically, we did a little camera test where we locked everything off, and then we just cycled through a whole bunch of lenses and took a look to see how they stacked up. And we shot it all in one day. In the end, we shot about 50 shots over about 8 or 9 hours. At some point, the model, who was very nice, started to drift off. We had to play some loud music to keep her going, but we got through, and it's pretty interesting stuff. The one thing I'll point out is, for LDS, you really need to have the latest firmware with an Alexa LF. We've run into this a couple of times with some different people that maybe haven't been keeping the LFs updated as often as they update the mini LFs. So you need to be at 4.3 before these will see the zooms. Mini LFs, you should be fine, but just try to stay to the most recent firmware. And what was really interesting, I discovered when I put /I lenses on the Alexa LF, even zooms, it'll come up with an integer focal length. When I put these up, I ended up with tenths of millimeters, which is really interesting. Signature primes are starting to become really popular for visual effects work because they're really good at distortion, and there's very little distortion. You really have to get into the extreme focal lengths before you see it. Breathing is minimal through the core focal lengths until you get to the really extreme ones. And I'm sensing the zooms are going to kind of fall into that same world, but I think it's really interesting to have tenths of a millimeter as far as LDS goes. So there's some stuff I want to talk to you about before I show you the test, because they have an impact. So one of the issues I ran into was the zooms only open up the T2.8, the primes open up the T1.8. Can't shoot them at different stops because too much stuff changes. So I shot everything at 2.8. And the issue, of course, with that is you've got cat's eye and the signature primes at T1.8. The zooms, you have it at T2.8. And when I stop down the signature primes to match the zooms, the cat's eye goes away. So the field illumination really evens out. Now, the design goal was to drop to about 30% in the corners on all the lenses at wide open, basically to make them all perfectly consistent. So all the signature primes, all the signature zooms will do that. The problem, of course, is when you compare the two, then suddenly the zooms look like they're really much more contrasty than the primes. And that's not actually the case. It's just the corners, the edges look darker at wide open. So it just feels like there's more contrast. There isn't. The zooms are ever so slightly lower in contrast than the primes, just because there's easily twice as much glass in these things. So that's going to happen. But when you look at this video, if you notice that effect, that's what's going on. The other part of this is the entrance pupil will shift. So we had to do a little scaling in post, and you might see a little bit of, we shot an actress or model in front of a mirror, a makeup mirror. that was reflecting our set, because it was honestly the most interesting thing we could do in our space with very little money during COVID, because we had to get in there with a minimal crew and do this. So we didn't compensate for the entrance pupil. The camera was locked off, and then the entrance pupil was what it was. And of course, in the zoom, it's going to change, and the primes are going to change depending on the prime. So we shot in 4.5K open gate, and then we finished in UHD, and then we scaled the primes a little bit to match what the zooms are doing, because the entrance pupil on the zooms was generally further forward. So that meant that the center of perspective was felt a little closer. So other than that, this is pretty much a straight comparison. Oh, and one other issue I'll point out, the 125 and the 200 focus drifts a little bit, so her eyes won't be perfectly sharp. And that's because, like I said, we did 50 shots in about 9 hours, and we gave her a headrest, and a couple times she started kind of drifting forward, and so we started playing the loud music. So you may notice that. But otherwise, I'm going to play this video. Hopefully it's not too choppy, but you should get a sense of how the zooms and the primes match. And there has been a little bit of color correction. The zooms are a little warmer than the primes, but our colorist says it's about a printer point, so it's pretty minimal. hopefully that wasn't too choppy. Hopefully you got the idea. One of the interesting things about the zooms is that the 65 to 300 actually focuses closer than the 280 signature prime by about 2 feet. So that's one of the reasons, well, that was the reason why the 280 shot was not as close as the, on the prime was not as close as the 280 on the zoom. So similarities, let's talk real quick about what they have in common. 200 line pairs in the center. That's the most we can see on a lens projector. The MTF is off the chart, but this is what you can see by eye. In the corners, probably 140 wide open by the time you close down and get into kind of the sweet spot where the cat's eye goes away and the image kind of flattens out. It's around 5.6. I've seen 200 in the corners as well. The core, the signature look is the same. So the lenses are warm. Signature primes are warm. The zooms are warm. Zooms are a little bit warmer just because there's a lot more glass in there. Consistent skin quality and texture, which is something we worked on really hard. And that actually has a lot to do with, I guess you would call it micro contrast. I mean, technically, that's not really well defined. So it's a difficult thing to quantify, but basically the lenses are such high resolution that the transitions across fine edges is very smooth. And as a result, we capture all the detail in skin, but there's no sensation of aliasing, that kind of artificial crispness that you would get from some lenses, particularly film lenses, where they really wanted to punch those low frequencies in order to get through to that bottom red layer. But you know, we don't have to worry about that here. To really get the fine frequencies right, did a lot for faces. There's consistent bokeh and focus roll off. Focus rolls off really quickly. And the bokeh, this is not just the highlights, this is the overall quality of the autofocus image. Hard edges drift away just very, very, very quickly. It's a really interesting sensation. I've covered this before. I've got some more images I can show you just to remind you what it looks like, but there are a lot of lenses that will preserve hard edges and backgrounds. It has a lot to do with, based on what I've seen, spherical aberration. Our spherical aberration is exceptionally well corrected. And there's a low contrast feel, which is interesting because we keep having people tell us these are low contrast lenses, but they're not. If you look at them on a waveform with a traditional low contrast lens, the black level comes up, and that's why it feels low contrast, because it's effectively like you're flashing a film stock. You would be flashing the sensor. These lenses don't do that. They have a clarity to them, so you actually see deeper into shadows, but the blacks are still crisp. You still keep that black level there. So the image doesn't feel like it's coming up and milking up. You always have a crisp black. And then there's zero focus ramping, which is basically what happens when, with a lot of lenses, if you're focused at infinity and then you focus closer, the exposure drops off. And that doesn't happen on these lenses. Doesn't happen with focus shifts, doesn't happen with zooming. You will see some edge vignetting when you zoom in, because that's just what happens with the zoom. The interest pupil drops way to the back. You're basically shooting down a tunnel and you're giving a little bit of a haircut to the light bundles at the edges of the lens. But in the center of the lens, it's completely consistent. T-stop stays the same all the way through. Now, there's some compromises we had to make in order to do that, and I'll cover that in a moment. So the differences, cat's eye, the exposure drop off at the frame edges. T1.8 on the primes gone by 2.8. On the zooms, it's 2.8 and then gone by 5.6, which once again, we're shooting down a tunnel, so we can't clean it up as quickly as we can with the prime, which is much shorter. Slightly, and I have to say this just because it's technically correct, slightly more chromatic aberration. It's still really minimal. There is some distortion in the zooms, a little bit of barrel at the wide end, and then a little bit of pincushion at the long end, but still pretty exceptional. Slightly warmer than the primes, not very much. Slightly lower contrast just because there's a lot more surfaces in there. So let's look at some tech specs. I've been putting this up front in my presentation just because we don't have a ton of footage from the signature zooms. We're actually getting a lot more right now. We have a second round of prototypes that just came to town. They're already going out on commercials. I think they're going out on a feature next week. and they're going to be kind of making the tour of North America. So they're going to be doing some different projects. But right now, I'm just going to talk about some tech specs because this is what I have to talk about. And I think with zooms, it's actually kind of interesting because with primes, you really want to see the look. With zooms, it's about how much is that look compromised. So I'll talk about that very quickly. So the primes, hopefully you're familiar, 16 focal lengths, 14 or T18, lighter than master primes by several pounds. Multi-format, which is something we don't emphasize enough. People think of these as large format lenses, but they're getting a lot of use on minis and some other cameras that in some cases have Super 35 8K sensors. Multi-camera, which is the point of the LPL mount. I'm not going to cover the LPL mount unless someone asks me, but if you want to know, ask me. And then they've got our signature look. And right now, this is what's currently out. A lot of really interesting stuff. What I think is really interesting is they keep ending up on period pieces, which I think is kind of fascinating. Emma, 1917, Enola Holmes are all period pieces that I've seen. I haven't seen all of these. Echo Boomers is coming out. Invisible Manor has been out. Hunting of Bly Manor is out now on Netflix. Yeah, they're going out and they're doing a lot of stuff right now, which is good. And hopefully the zooms will be shortly as well. So 4 zooms from 16 to 510. There is an extender I will talk a bit more about. It only works with the 65 to 300, and there's a very specific reason for that. They are all 2.8 all the way through the range. The 65-300 drops to 4.9 with the extender. I think it might actually, based on my testing, I think that might be a little conservative actually on the stop. It feels a little bit brighter to me, but I'll show you some pictures and you can see for yourself. Lighter than similar zooms because once again, they are magnesium. And we also made a number of choices in the optical design to use certain kinds of glass to keep the weight down. And then once again, multi-format, multi-camera, and then consistent look, that core look, the warmth and the bokeh and the skin, that all comes through. So I'll point out on this one, the 2 end zooms, the fronts are 156. Very specific reasons for that, which I'll go into in a bit. The middle 2 zooms are 114. And then one thing I'll point out with the 65 to 300, it's a big lens, but it only weighs 19 pounds. And actually we had an aerial company take this lens up to shoot some aerials, and they loved it because it's 8 or 9 pounds lighter than the lenses they've been using. And when you're working with kinds of stabilized heads that they're working with, having 9 pounds less weight actually makes a big difference. So let's just look at how they fit in. So we made some specific choices versus what other companies are choosing to do. And they're all valid choices depending on what you want to do. We made some choices depending based on what our core values are, and we're always really going after performance. And this doesn't always mean we have the advantage in size. It doesn't always mean we have the advantage in price, but there are specific reasons we're doing what we're doing. Now, in this case, so for example, the 16 to 32 that we're coming out with. So these lenses are not just for large format. We're trying to aim them at Super 35 as well. Because we're not going to come out with separate Super 35 lenses. We want these to work everywhere. We just thought this was a better range. And we also like kind of pushing the boundaries, and a difference of a few millimeters can actually make a big difference as far as optical design and cost. But that's kind of where we tend to go. We can try to push things a little bit. So even though there's maybe 3 millimeters difference on the wide end, it's a massive difference in how hard it is to make this lens. But that's what we chose to do, because once again, these aren't just large format lenses, these are Super 35 lenses as well. And we kind of did made that same choice with this range, because we could have gone for something a bit longer, but we kind of decided that we wanted to focus on this range for Super 35. And also because we're trying to match these to primes, it kind of limited us to what we're trying to achieve. Because if you start pushing things too far and trying to cover too wide a range, then you can't necessarily match the qualities that we've already defined by the signature prime family. So we did get a lot of requests, can't you make a lens with a longer range? We could have, or we could have pushed it forward and made the focal lengths a little bit longer. But once again, we didn't feel that would work super well for Super 35. And we also felt we couldn't match the quality of the primes to the degree that we wanted to. And, you know, once again, just trying to stretch the limits a little bit. You know, here we're just a little bit wider and a little bit longer. This is kind of our core focal length for medium format. We felt we could push things a little bit in this range and keep the signature prime look and quality. And then the 65 to 300. So, you know, we don't have the longest range, and actually what Ingenue is doing is very clever. I mean, it's a huge range, and I mean, that's a lot of flexibility on set. But once again, our goal is to match primes, and we couldn't adopt that range and still get what we felt was a good match. So what we did was we came out with a really amazing extender, and that extender is pretty phenomenal. It actually has 10 or 12 elements in it, so it's not a simple machine by any stretch of the imagination. You do lose a little quality, but it's not too bad. And actually, it'll work on the 280 signature prime, and because the base of that look is a prime, it's actually stunning optically. I didn't have it long enough last time to really capture a lot of footage. I just took a look through it on that shoot day where we were doing the comparison. And actually, I do have an image in here from that, but it's pretty stunning. Now, you can't make an extender that works with a lot of different lenses and make a good extender. So we made it to work only with the 65 to 300 that's and the 280 prime, and that's it. People have asked us, will it work with the 45 to 135 or the 24 to 75? No. But the point was not to duplicate focal lengths, it was to extend the range. And this gives you basically a 110 to 510 T4.9, very high quality. Now, something to know is you need to take the magnetic filter holder off the back of whatever lens you put in this for clearance issues. You try to put it in and lock it, it won't lock, you can't get it in quite far enough. But there's a magnetic holder on the back of the extender, so you can just take whatever filtration you're using and pop it on the back of the extender. Close focus doesn't change, which is kind of cool because you can get into 6 feet, I believe, on the 65 to 300. And at 300, you can get in quite tight. At 510, you can get in even tighter. The WCU4 will automatically compensate. Your focus marks will line up, and the LDS2 will provide completely accurate lens data through the extender. Now, T-stop, yeah, we kind of fall into the regular range. The one thing I'll point out is, you know, Fujinada has pointed out that they ramp from 2.9 to 3.5 on the 80 to 250, and that gives them benefits as far as size and weight and consistency. That's one area with the 65 to 300 where we basically, we didn't want to ramp, and that just resulted in a really big lens. Now, the magnesium helps because once again, it's 19 pounds, which is surprisingly lightweight for what it is. But there are advantages to making big lenses, and this is one of them. So when the entrance pupil is way up at the front, you know, with the wider focal lengths, you know, not so hard, but then once you zoom in, that entrance pupil gets bigger and it drops to the back. And of course, the entrance pupil changes as a ratio to the focal length. So when you get to the back of a 300, it's really big. So basically that forces us to make this front optical group really big. And then this channel, of course, has to be bigger as well. So that kind of forced us into making a bigger lens. But once again, in order to match the primes, this was a big deal. And also, we still have a lot of people at Arri who worked in film, and having a zoom that ramped in film was never a great thing, because unless you really tested it, shot tests, or just had really sensitive eyes, you might not know until the next day that you lost a half or 2/3 of a stop. And as a film company, we just decided we were going to go that extra length, that extra step. Now, once again, you will see some edge darkening, just like you do with most zooms, because this entrance pupil is looking down a tunnel. But the center, where you typically tend to frame most stuff on, you know, a lens that's that long, will stay a consistent 2.8 all the way through. Now, as far as weight, here's where we kind of fall into line. You know, we're pretty consistent with the others. Once again, the 65 to 300 is the biggest one. You know, it's about 10 pounds lighter than the Ingenue. The Ingenue does a lot more, but once again, there's trade-offs for that. And since we're trying to match this to a family of zooms, we didn't want to make those trade-offs. But that also allowed us to work with a shorter range. And you know, as a result, we could make a lighter zoom that's a little bit smaller, but will match our prime family. And that was the most important thing. Now, close focus, we actually do really well, because when I look at the specs, we come in close focus wise a little bit closer than just about everyone. Maybe not a ton, but we do come in closer. And then, as I mentioned before, when you put the extender on the 65 to 300, the close focus doesn't change, but you just get a much bigger image. And actually, I can show you that here. So this is just a video we made zooming through the full range of all three of our zooms. So yeah, it's a pretty cool extender. I'm really happy with the quality. I want to play with it a bit more to really get a sense of what it'll do. And this was actually still a prototype, as was the zooms. These were the very first prototypes. The prototypes that are going around now are the second round. And then that's going to be it before we roll out the final product. But they look very good. The only real difference were, between these and the final zooms would probably just be a little bit of stray light touch up. Actually, I'll talk about that a little bit later. But so there's the prime with the extender. So I don't know if your screens are high enough resolution to see that, but it looks, that's pretty spectacular on the 280 with the extender on that close up. And then we've got the prime and the zoom. So difference in close focus there, the 280 prime focuses to 8'3". The signature zoom will go, this is at 6'1". It'll go down to 6 foot. And then comparison with the extender. Yeah, the zoom is just a little bit, it's a little bit softer. Still pretty sharp, but just a little bit softer. And then we've got the 125 versus the 45 to 135. Same close focus distance, but since we can get that extra 10 millimeters, you can get a slightly tighter shot there. And of course, comparison by cost. Are we the cheapest? We are not, but we're ambitious. So that costs just a little bit more. This is where we fall. 65 to 300 comes with the extender. So that is part of the price. So when it ships, you will get an extender that works with that lens. Actually, I need to check. I don't think they're matched to the specific lens. I think you can mix and match the extenders to other 65 to 300s, and certainly to the 280 primes, because clearly we're not making extenders just for the primes. They're specifically for the zooms. You can use it with the 280 prime, but that wasn't the original design intent. So any questions? Because if not, I'm just going to do a little recap of what the signature look is. But if you have any questions, this might be a good time to stop.
What about availability, Art? When do you plan to deliver these?
They will ship in the two zooms I showed here, the 65 to 300 and the 45 to 135 are going to ship April. The other two we're probably looking at fourth quarter, October of next year. COVID kind of threw us a curveball. They were supposed to come out next summer, and they've been pushed back.
And then, I don't know if you're privy to say anything, but I'd imagine that a lot of these, the success of these lenses has to do with the rollout of the new Arri camera and what mount it will be.
Well, the next camera will be LPL. Basically, that's going to be the mount going forward.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, PL is limited when it comes to digital for a number of reasons. One of the reasons is we're trying to make near telecentric lenses in with the signature primes, and what that means is basically the rays at the edge of the field hit the sensor as close to dead on as possible, and sensors really like that. The problem with that is the back of the lens has to be as big as the sensor, and a PL mount won't do that for large format. And now, you know, you might shoot on a Super 35 sensor one day and the large format sensor the next day. And, you know, PL was really just designed for 35 millimeter. People weren't bouncing around a lot. Maybe, you know, when PL came out, people would shoot 16, but nobody was shooting 65. And now you might shoot 35 and 65, you know, on the same shoot. So we wanted a lens mount that would work for everything and that was really portable. We also shortened the flange depth on that, which is what all the still photography companies are doing, because it just makes it easier to make really high performance lenses when you shorten that flange depth. And there's no need to keep that extra space because we don't have a spinning mechanical shutter anymore. So, you know, we invented PL. When we started working on these lenses, we decided, like, you know, why are we still making this antiquated mount that doesn't really serve anyone anymore? And we license it, we give it away. Basically, I think, you know, sign a piece of paper, give us €1 or something, and, you know, all the specs are yours. So anyone can use it and anyone can implement it. But, you know, and the idea is that it just becomes the new PL mount going forward. And actual PL, you can still use actual PL lenses. There's an adapter that's rock solid that you just pop right in, and it just bumps the lens out to the correct flange depth, and you're done. And it passes LDS and all that. But LPL is the way we're going.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. Any other questions? Otherwise, I can just I can show you pictures if you want pictures, and then I can do a quick recap of the look. And then I've got some stills from Echo Boomers and Blind Manor that I can kind of walk you through and just show you where I'm seeing the look. Okay, let's do that. Let me go back, share my screen, make sure the share computer sound box is checked. Okay, all right. So actually, this is one of Logan's frames from the Heist, and if you haven't seen that yet, I highly recommend it. It's on our YouTube channel. This is the interior shot where he was talking about the line. I didn't capture a frame where we had people directly in front of the windows, but you'll see that in the actual video. And there's that beautiful bokeh that I love so much that just feels so dreamy and soft. But I've got some comparison images for that. So here's the core of the look that you're going to see in both the primes and the zooms. Warm, smooth, natural skin rendition. Warm because of the glass that we chose, and then the smooth, natural skin rendition, which is it's counterintuitive, but by getting the MTF up so high, you see the transitions across skin details better. So you don't have the kind of aliasing you get from really punching up the coarse detail in you know, film lenses that make them look kind of extra crispy in film. I think someone's got their mic open, if we could close that. So, and then the focus roll off, once again, it goes out really quick. It softens really quickly, and that results in really nice, soft, dreamy backgrounds. It also results in extra separation at deeper stops, and I have an image that will show you that. And then low contrast feel, that's just because we see deeper into the shadows, but without sacrificing blacks. Now, this is really interesting. This is a 9K image on a prototype camera built by a gentleman by the name of Pavel Octel, who lives in Australia. He does a lot of large screen, large venue work, and he's building his own camera, and he asked us for 125mm prime to do some testing. And when you punch in on this image, there is a ton of detail there. Now, this is a JPEG, so it's not the best quality, but there's a lot of fine detail here that doesn't necessarily feel super crispy, and that's part of this MTF secret sauce. I mean, it's basically just building lenses that resolve high frequencies really, really well with really high contrast. They just feel smoother and more natural, like your eye sees it. And that's kind of what we've been hearing from a lot of people. And actually, Logan had a great quote from when we first rolled out the signature primes. He said, "These are like looking through a really beautiful window." Now, I shot some comparisons a long time ago, and I'm just going to run through those real quick. Here's an example of a lens that kind of does what I think a lot of film lenses do. If you look at this hair, this is just a little bit extra crunchy. A little bit, I mean, you can see it and it looks really sharp, but this is the kind of thing that you might see in a film lens or maybe in a still lens where, you know, still photographers really want that extra crispiness. They want to see that detail because they feel like it makes the image lift off the page. Maybe not exactly what we want in the cinema world. I can kind of feel that extra crispiness in her eyebrow, and there's a little bit extra texture, I feel, kind of in her skin as a result of that. Now here, when I show this in person, this is actually, I've got a high resolution TIFF image embedded in the PowerPoint. There's a tremendous amount of detail here, but it just looks like a hair. It doesn't feel crisp, it doesn't feel soft, it's just there. And I think you can feel a certain amount of that in this eyebrow as well, because it's not kind of as crispy, I think, as this feels. I mean, this is an interesting look. It just tends not to be very popular in cinema. So this is a little bit more of a, I say, like a fine brush rendition. There's a little bit more subtlety in there. And I think that's, the skin feels just a little bit smoother as well. Now, if we go look at a bunch of different lenses, this is an old comparison I did. There's some of these lenses aren't actually really being used much anymore. This is a couple of years ago. You can see the signature prime is the warmest of the bunch. And that was intentional because we wanted to punch, you know, flesh tone a little bit more. And also it just kind of factored into the optical design of what we were trying to achieve. You have certain directions you can go, and we decided to go warm. The other thing is you might notice that the signature prime face is just a little bit brighter. Now the signature prime tends to, it doesn't focus ramp. These other lenses dropped maybe a half stop when focused from infinity to 6 feet, and the signature prime didn't. And the zooms are exactly the same. The zooms do not change exposure when you focus, when you zoom. You know, and I will always stress that because I know everyone here, you know, got a lot of lens aficionados. When we zoom in, we're talking about the center of the field, especially on the 65 to 300. The edges will darken a little bit. Can't get around that, but the center of the field will be a consistent 2.8 all the way through. And I love this image. I just ran around during COVID and shot with some different lenses to see what would happen. This lens on the left is a very neutral lens. And what I think is really interesting is when I look at the sky here, it's a blue sky, it's fine. It feels like it's either blue or it's blue, it got a little bit of green in it. It maybe feels like it's tilting a little bit, tiny bit towards cyan. There's a lot of nice saturated greens in the hills, and you know the wood is very neutral. Now the signature prime, a little bit warmer, and what I really like about this sky is this blue has just a tiny bit of red in it, and that's actually what I can't see it now because it's overcast here, but normally when I look out my kitchen window, which is where I am now, and I look at the sky, by eye, the sky is a very complex, slightly reddish blue, and that's what really jumped out in this image, because you know it's an image of a fence and some hills. It's not that compelling necessarily on its own, but what really struck me is the color of the sky, because this feels very real to me. The wood is a little warmer, and then there's a little bit more variation in the green grass, I think. So, you know, interesting. It's interesting to see what the spectral response of these lenses will do to natural environments. And it does warm everything. It does pop the warm tones a little bit more, but it does also affect the cool tones in an interesting way that I really like. Now, the focus roll-off. I love this image because this is actually a 15 signature prime at close focus. And that rock is incredibly detailed. There's so much detail in that. And yet you can see in the sand next to it, you can see kind of the plane of focus here. And by here, it's already starting to roll off. It almost feels like there's a little bit of spherical aberration creeping in. There isn't, because these are really well corrected, but it's got that kind of sharp, soft look that you see when you've got a lens with some spherical aberration. And you're starting to get that here, and then by here, all the sharp edges are gone. So these lenses roll out pretty quickly. Now, this is an extreme example, but it's also an example of the fact that, for example, this 15 has the same quality as you know, the 200 or the 280, and the same quality as the zooms. Now, what does this really translate to? Well, this is one of my earliest tests where I took an older lens with some spherical aberration and put it up against a signature prime. Same focal length, same distance, same format. And I just wanted to see what the differences were. And what I find really interesting is that there's so much texture in this background. And what I also noticed is that in this mailbox, all the text is still readable, whereas in the signature prime, it's not. And I've often heard people talk about lenses rolling out of focus faster than others, or not rolling out of focus faster than others. And I'd always thought it was that there was lower resolution lenses felt like the depth of field carried longer because the point of focus was never that sharp. So you didn't have a sense of you know, how quickly the image was losing focus on either side of that very sharp point. But there's also something else here with spherical aberration, where spherical aberration actually preserves details, especially behind the point of focus. And we just don't do that. So that's the biggest difference. And this actually carries through even at deeper stops, because on the left, you can still see a lot of texture, I think, in the trees and in the bushes and in the highlights. And the mailbox is still just a little bit sharper than the signature prime. So even at T4, it's kind of interesting. So I've had this idea for a while that you can shoot at deeper stops and still get a certain amount of separation from the background that you couldn't get before necessarily, because the background still, it loses all this hardness and all the textures blend. So there's a little bit more separation. There's nothing really to distract your eye. And then of course there's the contrast side, where it feels to me like you can just see deeper into the darkest grays. And this is something we've consistently heard. Actually, Shelley Johnson tested these lenses, and he talked about how much he liked their journey into black. He felt like they gave an extended toe. And Logan actually talked a bit about that as well. Now, we have one of our very first signature zoom launch videos. I don't know if I should show you the video just because it's going to be really choppy. I'll just show you some stills that I pulled from it. But this was shot in Beijing, and it's with both lenses. And once again, there's this really interesting sense of, you know, you can see all the detail here. It's really compelling, I think. And this reminds me of what I see in HDR. Because if you think of what the definition of HDR is, it's basically just the way our eyes see the world. And that doesn't really sound that interesting necessarily. But when you see it on a screen, suddenly it's extremely interesting. It's very compelling. I find HDR stunning, honestly. And the same thing I think happens when you have a very, very high resolution lens that doesn't necessarily punch those low frequencies in the same way. And it drills down into the high frequencies and reproduces an image that's very, very natural. When I see these images in high resolution, I don't feel like they're sharp. I don't feel like they're soft. I just feel like I'm looking at something. And the sensation is very interesting because by definition, it doesn't sound like it should be interesting, And yet by eye on a screen, it's really compelling, especially in UHD. Some of the stuff in UHD is really amazing. I like this image because it's got text in it, and text is always a great way for me to tell when something's starting to roll out of focus. And so I can see here, even though the focus is on her, and I can see this drum is in focus, we're already losing detail in the background. So I don't know what stop they were shooting at. I didn't have access to the raw footage, so I can't read the LDS, but you know, it's probably fairly wide open.
Hey, Art, can you talk a little about LDS? And I think a lot of people here know about it, but a lot of people also don't know about it and the advantages and how it can benefit the cinematographer through post-production and everything.
Well, yeah, I mean, we capture an extraordinary amount of data, and if you pull any of your footage, and there's a free app on our website called Arri Metadata Extractor, and just do a Google search, it'll come right up, and just run ProRes or Arri Raw through it, and it will give you a massive spreadsheet of everything that's going on in the camera. But it'll also give you a huge amount of information about what's going on in the lens. And what's interesting so LDS was our original implementation, and it was a little bit limited. LDS2 is extensible. It's getting bigger, and we're actually working with a number of different organizations, and especially working with companies in the visual effects world, because we really want to get in there and be really, really granular about what's going on with the lens. You know, there's talk of tracking entrance pupil locations and stuff like that. I mean, all sorts of distortion information. Although, ironically, with the primes, we're finding that distortion information is not maybe as important until you get into the wider ones, maybe 18 and wider. The 12 will show you some distortion, but that's not super surprising. The 15 won't show you a ton of distortion. What you'll see is perspective shift on the sides, like a stretching effect, which is basically the same as if you look at a globe, like a map, you know, a traditional globe with maps of the, you know, continents and everything on it, and then you flatten that out. The center is going to look pretty normal, but the edges are going to get a little, you know, a little stretched. And that's what you're seeing. You're not actually seeing distortion, which is pincushion and barrel where straight lines bend. You'll see some of that. You'll see more of it on the 12. The 15 is remarkably good. But at the edges of the frame, you'll get a little bit of that stretching. And the 18 does that a little bit as well. But middle of the range and the longer lenses in the prime family, that's virtually gone. But at the same time, we want to give people as much information as we possibly can. And then also LDS2 is meant to work with other lenses too. So we're really building it out. I don't think we've really done a great job of telling people how powerful it is and how powerful it's going to be, but it is a project inside Arri that we're working on really, really aggressively. And if you want to see what's what's available, what's possible, I would suggest looking at the Arri metadata extractor and just see how much information comes out, because it ends up being a massive Excel file that just every line is its own frame, and it just goes on for multiple screens. It's pretty amazing. Let's see. All right.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good education point for future presentations is LDS, because like we're in sort of the secondary market in the Pacific Northwest, you know, we're not like LA or New York or Atlanta, you know, and I think our clientele could benefit from it, but they don't know anything about it or not a lot about it. So anyway.
No, I agree. And, you know, being the company we are, we tend to go really, really, really granular with that stuff. And sometimes it holds us up because, you know, this is the saying, you know, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. We tend to be a little bit guilty of that because when we come out with stuff, it tends to be really granular and really deep. But yeah, that would be a really good presentation. I should work on that because I think it would be really helpful, especially in secondary markets, which is where I spent most of my career as a DP. A lot of production companies are doing their own visual effects in-house. And you know, one thing that was a real problem was I became the de facto visual effects supervisor. So sometimes I would have to stop things on set and say, hey, you know, if we spend 10 more minutes now, I can save you $20,000 later. But I think it would be really helpful to have more data in post to try to make things even easier. And also for traditional post houses, the margins, unless things have gotten vastly better, traditional post house margins or visual effects house margins are really low. So I think anything we can do to make that easier is a benefit. And that's certainly what we're working on internally. All right, so I'm going to plow through some pictures here because I want to get to the food shot because I find the food shot really compelling. Now, once again, she's got great skin, but it's not like I'm not seeing the detail and the texture in her skin. It just looks very smooth and very natural. And that's what we worked really hard on. And actually, the one place I really see texture a lot is in food. I recently found out that there's a tabletop DP in LA who uses signature primes for exactly this reason. And it's because it captures all this really interesting detail and subtlety in food. And this shot really stood out to me because I had previously seen another shot captured on a Sony Alpha Series camera by John Fowler back when we were rolling out the signature primes. And he went out to lunch with our product manager, and he just happened to grab this shot of some food. And the amount of detail in that is just stunning. Once again, it just kind of feels like I could reach through the screen and kind of, you know, tap it. It kind of feels that real. But once again, that was the purpose. The design was, you know, as we get into 4K and 8K, all these formats are going to become more immersive. And aberrations tend to fight against that. And I'm not saying there's not going to be a place for those. It's just that that's not the place we tend to go. We tend to go to the place where we're making the higher performance products that in this case, I think will work very well with these upcoming display technologies, HDR, UHD, whatever's coming down the road. Now, I'll talk a little bit about flares. So this is the first prototype. These flares were a little bit greener than we wanted. Now, we tend to like blue flares. I mean, there's lots of different kinds of flares, but blue tend to be the most popular. I think it's because our color vision communicates a brightness signal based on the colors in the image, and each color has a different weight. So green tends to be about 70% of our sense of brightness, red tends to be about 22%, blue tends to be about 8%. So you can have a very saturated blue, but it doesn't feel that bright. So if you want a lens flare, you can have it, but it won't necessarily be outrageously distracting. And I think that's important as we get into HDR, because in Rec 709, that flare is never going to be more than about 2 stops brighter than middle gray. But in a consumer set at home in HDR, that can easily be, what, 5 stops? 3 to 5 stops, depending on how good their display is. So that can start getting a little distracting. We wanted to address that. We didn't want to eliminate flares, but we want to make them into more of a tool that you're not necessarily afraid to use. So that's something that the current round of prototypes has significantly improved. We shifted that more towards blue. And the stray light control in general is just really, really good. You can shoot it in some really bright backgrounds and the image doesn't milk out. For example, I'm still seeing some fairly crisp blacks in here, and right in here, and here, you know, in spite of the fact that I'm probably looking at sun through light clouds right there. And then, you know, no real ghosting. You know, we've worked really hard on this aspect of it, and it's really interesting to see shooting into bright objects, and I mean, especially in HDR in the tests that I've seen with these lenses, it's a really interesting experience. I saw some footage shot that I guess we captured in Munich. It's a snowy field with a bare tree and the sun peeking through light clouds right behind the branches. And the snow holds, the tree is very dark because it's backlit, so it's a nice etched black tree against a glowing bright sun. In HDR, it was just stunning. This is an image that kind of shows what happens when you stop down a bit. I'm guessing this is the 45 to 135. And I'm also guessing this is probably 5.6 because the bokeh at the edges of the frame is round, but I still see a lot of separation. You know, I mean, all this back here, you still have, you know, the brightness, you know, the highlights standing out, but they don't feel necessarily hard. And then you have areas in here that are just, they're basically all the same color and tonal value, and they just kind of blend together. All the hard edges go away. So you can look at a person right here and they're not over sharpened, and yet they pop out from the background really well because your eye is attracted to the edges that you do see that have contrast, and the only point in the frame is here, even though you're stopped down for a bit. With, you know, some older lenses, you're going to see those rings, and then you're going to see a lot of texture. And even with some current lenses I've seen will do this, the bokeh feels harder. And of course, by bokeh, I'm not just talking about highlights. I'm talking about this overall structure. Like even these trees would have a harder edge because, you know, the spherical aberration tends to allocate more information to the edges of highlights. I mean, you can see it in highlights, you know, better than you can see it in regular backgrounds. And that's why we talk about bokeh as highlights, but it's really everything here. And that's what we were really working on. And then at night, it's just really dreamy. This is kind of where we came up with the description of, this is like water running down a window. You know, if you imagine a window and it's pouring rain and water is just coming down that window in sheets, to me, it would look like this. I mean, this is just, there's no real structure to it. It's just this beautiful kind of soft, almost like you've taken a watercolor and, you know, gone over it with a wash and kind of just blended all the details just a little bit more. And then of course, there's a ton of detail in images like this. The upcoming 16 to 32 is apparently extremely high resolution. And we actually played a little bit of a game with these lenses where the longer they get, they do resolve just a little bit less. Mostly because we figured they were going to be used on faces more than anything else. But on the wide end, especially in the 16 to 32, it's very, very, very high resolution. And the idea is that with a lens like that, you're shooting wide shots. And in wide shots, you want the detail because you're shooting stuff that's far away. With longer lenses, you're not necessarily doing that. You're often closer on stuff. So we decided to be just a little bit kinder to faces on the longer focal lengths. But the wider ones, there's an insane amount of detail. There's an insane amount of detail anyways. I think we've overcompensated on the 16 to 32 based on what I understand about it. And then once again, just the dynamic range, especially in the shadows. There's a lot of tonality in her face that's really interesting. You know, her face, from what I understand, this is entirely natural light. It looks like she's catching some light off the cutting board. She's probably catching some light off her clothes. There's a lot of shadow detail here. There's a lot of color information in the shadows. So once again, you know, really digs into the shadows. And then we had a couple of DPs say, how does this lens do under red light? Excuse me. It's funny, we had a number of people ask us this. And then of course, the first DP we send the zooms to goes and shoots a scene under red light. So if you go to the Arri channel, you can watch this. It's called BMI Sisters. And it's a really, really nice little piece. But it was really funny that the first DP we sent it to just decided to do this this dark room scene and make everything red. And it holds up. Let me get my red pointer here. Sorry, getting a little dry here. There's a lot of detail in this eye, which kind of surprised me. Because, you know, there's a lot of lenses that, I mean, you know, lenses will focus generally differently. The witness mark will shift under light that's saturated. But there's some lenses that can't focus it at all. And this lens does really well. And it's a zoom. Once again, you know, shadow detail, digging in, you know, preserving color in the shadows. There's a lot of detail, for example, here, natural light shooting in a tunnel. And clearly this is a higher ISO shot because there's a lot of noise in her face, but really crisp black in her helmet. And I can still see her eye right in there. So these lenses really dig deep into shadows. I really like that. And then under natural light, you know, just shooting a car at night, there's so much detail inside the car just from passing street light. This was shot on a freeway somewhere. It's just really interesting. I mean, it is almost like looking through a window, just because I can see so much detail that I'm not used to seeing. I feel like a lot of the times when I see stuff like this shot at night, it feels just a little bit muddy, a little bit abstract. And maybe that's good, depending on what you're shooting. But if you don't want that, we can give you an alternative. Now, I'll just go through these real quick because I pulled some stills that illustrate this look in a number of features that are out now. And what's really interesting is we're finding DPs using these with nets to varying degrees. This DP decided that he was going to, I think I mentioned this earlier, he decided that for some shots he was going to work with a very fine brush, and some shots he was going to work with a coarse brush. And the fine brush was without the nets. And then of course the coarse shots were with the nets. But it's just really interesting to see. And I just pulled these shots from the trailer, and I just pulled the images that I thought were really interesting and evocative. And there's just a lot of information here. There's a lot of subtlety of color. It's really interesting. This is really, I think, fascinating because there's so much right at the point of focus. I can just feel the texture of the leather, and the focus roll off is really interesting. And it's interesting. I feel a little bit of that spherical aberration, focus roll off feel, just as images are right on the edge of going out of focus. There's something really interesting that happens. I'm sure camera assistants aren't going to like this, but I think DPs will be very happy. There's a phenomenon that we've heard about with master primes that I see in signature primes as well. It's a little bit different. Master primes are designed for film, so they tend to pop the low frequencies more, whereas signature primes go a bit deeper. But there's still this kind of sensation that you can cut people out of backgrounds. You know, there's a lot of depth, and people really pop out. And I feel like in this situation, it's just because the background has gone so smooth, and he's got a nice line against the background. And it's not artificial, it's just that he's clearly in focus, and the background is so soft that he just stands out more. I love shots like this that feel so, you know, naturally lit and dig really into the shadows, and you can still see the saturation deep into the shadows. Get rid of my pointer. Is that pointer not going away? There it goes. Shots like, let's see this next one, where once again, I feel like I'm seeing a clarity in the shadows on his face that I don't ordinarily see. I feel like there's a tonality, a tonal scale that's maybe a little bit stronger than I see a lot of the time. And then just once again, this interesting contrast between in focus and out of focus, and how soft the backgrounds can be and how dreamy they can be. And I'm guessing this was shot probably pretty close to wide open because that background's way out of focus. And sometimes the structure just goes away completely and it just becomes very, very, very abstract. And of course, changing the f-stop, you can modulate that a bit. Even at deep stops, you get some separation, but sometimes the background just becomes very much like a watercolor painting that someone kind of spilled some water on. It just, everything kind of smears. Skin tone looks really nice. Close-ups, you know, don't be afraid of close-ups. You'll see all the detail in the skin, but it's not going to feel etched. It's not going to feel artificial. It's just going to feel like it's there, like it's very natural. And if you want to bring it out, or you know, use lighting to bring it out, you can sharpen it in post. You can do whatever you want. But naturally, you're not going to get an overly sharp or overly soft look out of these lenses. It's just going to be real. And then, of course, I like this last shot just because there's so much detail there. It's really interesting. I could see just it looks like it's a paper mache mask. And I can see, you know, bits of where the paper's been stuck together. It's really interesting how much detail there is. Once again, it's not forced, it's just there. It's just real. It's really interesting. And now I'll show you one more example. This is lots of use of rear nets. They look like black nets to me. And it's a really interesting look because I feel like it's a combination, a really interesting combination of modern and vintage. That's, you know, that's a pretty heavy look, but at the same time, there's just some quality to it that I find really interesting because it feels a little bit like a vintage lens, and yet I can see through it more clearly. I mean, there is something magical about nets, I have to admit, and just the way, say, the highlights are bleeding through the fine detail of her hair, or kind of bringing up the shadows a little bit in, here in the bushes, and then of course the trees and the skyline just kind of blending in with the skyline just a little bit more, and the shadows, milking up a little bit. And there's something really nice about nets. And just, once again, even, I don't know if this doesn't necessarily look like it has a net, or maybe it's not a very strong net, but just the clarity and the detail. I mean, you can really feel the texture. I mean, once again, I'm looking at a higher resolution image than you are, but I can see a lot of texture here. And it's actually a little bit of eye candy, because there's so much for my eye to see. And it's so interesting. They just have this flat surface with this much texture, I think is really interesting. And I'm guessing, I haven't seen this, but I'm guessing this shot lasts only a few seconds. But in a still image, I can look at this for quite a long time. It's really interesting. There's a lot there. Once again, the black net feel, and the fact that you can really dig a lot of detail out of the shadows. Now this is probably a visual effects shot. I don't know how they really shot this. They may have shot it just a lot brighter and brought it down. I don't know, but I do see a lot of interesting detail in her face. And then, even here, I can still make out his eye here, just in the shadows. And a fairly dark background, I can still see a fairly clean line between him and the background. And yet this is clearly being played right on the edge, which I really love. I love dark images. Hey, I was a DP, so I love going to the dark side. Once again, that kind of combination modern vintage look, because clearly a very good lens, but with that little bit of net going on, that adds that kind of glow, that kind of almost spherical aberration, smoothness. It's a really interesting combination look. And I haven't watched this yet. This is totally my genre. I haven't watched this yet, but I need to take a look and see how all this plays. You can see the net to varying degrees here. Here I see it mostly in the highlights. This next image, I can see it, very strongly in this kid's face. That feels like a classic net behind the lens look, but also just the way this background is, once again, so kind of dreamy and ethereal, and there's no structure here. Very, very soft, very, very smooth. It kind of feels to me like, it reminds me a little bit of maybe the longer Cook Speed Panchros, maybe. It doesn't have that same kind of, maybe, I don't know if sloppiness is the word, but lack of precision, because there's a bit more, I think, precision to this bokeh somehow. I mean, it's not a sloppy feeling, but at the same time, it's just very dreamy. Everything blends beautifully and consistently. And even, by the time we get here, she's very clearly soft. I mean, even here, there's just no structure. There's no hard edges. Now, without a net, this would be very much, I think, like that other mask shot that I found so interesting, because you would see all this detail much more strongly. And the net is lowering the resolution and also the contrast, but still, it's a very interesting image, I think, just with all that texture and that little bit of extra softness to it. I just like this image because it's so cool. It's another example of how to use bokeh, and how easy it is to use the soft bokeh in these lenses to create some really compelling and interesting effects, because the backgrounds just become so dreamy and so so quickly. Once again, another interesting little example of bokeh. I liked this because here, I mean, there's a lot of texture here, but it's not necessarily distracting. And part of that is probably because it's darker. Probably part of that is probably because it's cooler. But also, it's got no hard edges, and a texture like this isn't distracting as long as the hard edges are gone. It doesn't draw your eye as strongly, and it just recedes into the background. And I really like that quality about these lenses, in case I haven't said that enough already. And then, once again, for visual effects, we're seeing a lot of usage in visual effects, and the visual effects supervisors we've been able to talk to, who do work that involves signature prime say that the material tends to go together very easily. It makes their life a lot easier. So, and we're anticipating the zooms will do the same. Once again, the reason I'm showing you signature prime images is to communicate the look that carries over into the zooms. And the zooms will not be as perfect as the primes because that's just not possible yet, but they're going to be the core look. You can intercut them within a scene. It's not going to be an issue at all. All right, so that's probably most of what I've got. Oh, actually, let me try to stop the share here because this is, I wasn't going to show this because it's a video and video is not working so well. But let me try to get out of this. There we go. Okay, so let's see who's left. Any questions? Oh, we got some questions on the side. Let's see. Are these zooms made in Japan like the primes? Yes, made by the same company. And we went with them because they work in a lot of fields that require very high precision optics that I'm not officially allowed to talk about. And also because they've never made cinema primes before. So basically they were willing to do whatever we wanted. And we wanted to do something so different because even though we don't make our lenses, we spec them out to a T. We define the look. We define all the tech specs, how much chromatic aberration, how much distortion, how much everything that's permissible. And then we give it to them and we say, make this lens. And they've done a spectacular job. They come in on time, they come in on budget. The quality control has been really exceptional. Let's see. For the large format areas, what would be considered the minimum exit pupil for a lens used on such a camera? I'm not sure how to answer that question. Yeah, I'm not sure what that question is asking. If you want to retype it, be more specific, and I can try to answer that.
It refers to the telecentric issue of the lens.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I don't know exactly how to answer that one. What I do know is that if you're trying to make a near telecentric lens, you know, you basically push the exit pupils deep into the lens as you can. It's usually at least 10 or 12 centimeters inside. And then that becomes the center of perspective from the, you know, from the back of the lens going, you know, out, you know, projecting out the back. The farther in you can push that, the shallower the rays are coming out the back. So if the exit pupil is way at the back, it's going to be like this, because you're right at the back of the lens trying to, you know, light up a large format sensor. But if you can push that back in, then the sides of that triangle become much shallower. Now, at that point, if you have a small lens mount, you're just going to cast a shadow on the sensor. So what exactly that circle is, I don't know. I'm assuming that I think LPL is 62 millimeters in diameter in the back. That's a number I haven't thought about in a long time, but I'm sure that that is probably.
I've heard specs 100 millimeters or greater, which is really a focal length issue. That they're converting one lens kind of into another, and it's like putting a wide angle adapter on a telephoto lens, if that means anything. But
so are you saying 100 millimeters or greater inside, exit pupil inside the lens, or the diameter?
Yes, inside.
Inside, yeah, that's what I've heard as well. Let's see, link to the Zoom Prime comparison video. I don't think we've posted that publicly yet. There's some debate because, you know, two of the focal lengths are a little soft. So we may only be showing that when we can explain that. But I need to, yeah, I would like to show that publicly, but because it wasn't perfect, and actually, honestly, we were a little rushed because the Zooms had to go straight to, like, we had one day to shoot everything we wanted to shoot. And that test was only one of the things that we looked at. I need to redo that at some point. Have we announced a specific sensor size of the new Super 35 camera? No, sorry.
Actually, they said Sebastian said it's going to be the same as the current Alexa in the chat.
I mean, as far as the resolution?
He said 4K, 403.
Oh, the aspect ratio. Yes, the aspect ratio
and resolution. He said 4K.
Okay. Yeah, it'll be minimum. Yes. 4K. Let's see. Abrupt follow-up. Does the abrupt follow-up of focus redefine acceptable depth of field circles of confusion? Possibly. I mean, you know, all that stuff is based on. I mean, if you're using what one of my mentors used to call the prayer wheel, which was the rotating depth of field calculator, that, you know, that was just ballpark. I mean, you really need lens specific depth of field tables for any lens you're going to use, because the way the depth of field rolls off on either side of the point of focus, it is affected by different factors and it can vary. So circles of confusion is only one aspect of that. I haven't dived into that as deeply as possible because it's difficult sometimes to get people to find the people who can explain that, because a lot of the people who understand that don't necessarily understand how it's important to us, so they don't necessarily come out and talk to you or volunteer that information or understand why it's interesting. So I still need to find out someone who can talk to me about that.
Yeah, because if you've got that immediate fall off, and you know what, on a typical, you know, depth of field chart for a stop, you know, that would say, hey, well, you're gonna, sure, we can hold focus on these two people and this person's a little plane behind. I'm just wondering if, you know, that immediate like micro contrast that you've got on your plane of focus is going to be more apparent that the person behind is just a little softer.
It probably will. And actually, I have a couple of slides here that I didn't show that I will show. This is from an old presentation. Let me share this again, because this was a real eye opener for me. All right, let me get into presentation mode. All right, there we go. And okay. Are you seeing the grid?
Yes.
Am I sharing the right screen? Okay. Yep. Okay, good. Okay, so this was really interesting because I lined up a bunch of lenses, because I've always heard people talk about lenses rolling off quicker or less quick, and it was never something I had really paid much attention to. But I did hear there was a DP who tested these for a TV series. He said these roll off really fast. So I went and I shot this distortion chart at an angle with a bunch of different lenses. Signature prime, I don't remember what lens X was. I remember what lens Y was, but it's a really obscure lens. And then a rehoused Cook Speed Panchro, TLS rehoused. Because they don't make them anymore, so I can name it, and it's a reference. You know, it's a reference lens that's 50 years old, but you know, still looks great. And I actually shot a lot of commercials with these for about a year because, you know, it was my go-to set of lenses. I just loved the look, and I was used to thinking of these as being very soft lenses, but when I looked at the focus roll-off, they actually ended up being harder than just about, you know, I mean, there was only one lens that was the lens Y, which is that was a more vintage lens that had really strong donut bokeh, and the Cook Speed Panchro, the wider focal lengths had really strong donut bokeh as well. When you get into the longer focal lengths, then you've got the opposite. You've got the hot center that bleeds off, which is a really, really beautiful look, and that's the look that kind of reminds me of the Signature Prime look. But it was interesting to see the Signature Prime, same distance, basically same focal length, same stop, everything. It's much softer than the others. And part of this, a huge part of this was spherical aberration. It seems that spherical aberration with that donut bokeh will give an extra bit of sharpness as when you move into whatever range that donut bokeh appears. Now, you can have donut bokeh on the far side of the point of focus, which is usually the way it happens when it happens. But then on the front side, you end up with the hot center that bleeds off. Now, it would be much nicer to have that effect on the far side of focus, but I've seen very few lenses that will do that because I think that's a much nicer look. It blends a lot more. But that also means that the focus is going to feel like it rolls out faster in front of the point of focus versus here on the far side of the point of focus. So this was an eye-opener to me, because the way it had always been explained to me was that lenses that felt like the focus carried longer just never got that sharp. So you couldn't tell the difference between really sharp and not so sharp, because the difference between the two was never that great. And that was actually something we heard a lot with master primes, is, master primes, when they were sharp, they were so sharp that when they went out of focus, you could see it more quickly. I think there's a little bit of that here, except in this case, it's not that we feel as sharp as a master prime. It's just that the bokeh is softer than just about anything I've seen. And that, I think, factors more into this feel of fall off more than anything else, is the fact that that donut bokeh affects everything. It's not just in the highlights, it's every high contrast edge in the background of an image. So that was something interesting I found. I still find it really fascinating. I love doing tests, and I'll go out and test for stuff and find stuff I never knew existed, and I just love that. Let's see, that's all the questions I see in chat. Anyone have anything else they want to talk about while we're here? I threw a lot of stuff at you, so either I did a really good job, or everyone's asleep, or I put you into information overload, because I've been accused of doing that on occasion.
Any other questions?
All right, no one's. Oh, very good. Some nice compliments. And Ephraim, hey, we worked together a few times, long time ago. And someone else messaged me and said, were you a camera assistant back in the 90s? Yes, 87 to 92. I was not a camera assistant for very long, but yes, I was in LA doing that camera assistant thing.
All right, if that's
Okay,
about it.
well,
yeah, thanks so much, Art. That was amazing.
Yeah, sure. And if you want to reach me, I'm easy to find, lenses@arri.com. And if you have questions about anything, just fire away. That's why I'm there. And I love to geek out about this stuff. And I feel like this is the right crowd to invite to geek out with me, because not everyone wants to go into that kind of detail. But yeah, ask me a question at any level, and if I don't have the answer, I will try to find it.
Great.
And thank you, Michael. Really appreciate this. This is a huge resource. I've been watching a bunch of these, and I've learned a ton. So thank you for doing this.
You bet. And yeah, this will be on our website, kernercamera.com, in the Lens Summit section, and it's also on our Facebook page. So you can check this event out as well as previous ones. We've probably got about 12 or 13 up there. And look for more to come. We really don't have anybody lined up next for the Virtual Lens Summit, but we'll probably figure it out and keep monitoring us on Instagram. And everybody who's registered is on our master mailing list. You can always unsubscribe from that if you would like, but I don't know why you would. Thanks for showing up, everybody, and we'll hope to see you again soon.